I wanted to do something a little different with today's video, so I'm going to show you how I draw maps. This is for a D&D game I run about once or twice a month. And essentially what I start out with is actually a photograph of the map of the world that the campaign is set in. And I took a tiny little chunk of that map in the town that the party was supposed to be going around, and I started from there. I laid in the outline of the river and the dock of the town itself that connects to the river. Now, the problem with doing it this way is that the scale of the map is absolutely massive. It's an entire continent on the map, so when I zoom in, even then, the scale is huge, which means when I drew in the dock and the harbor master, in order to get it back to kind of that square there, assuming that the square is the center of the town, I had to fill things in quite a bit. You can see I start with the harbor master by the dock, then I drew in a market, and in the middle of the city I'm drawing in a fortified structure. Essentially the city grew out from the harbor master, eventually gained enough prominence to receive some fortification, receive a wall, receive a market. It became very wealthy. So once I've done that, I've actually taken away now the white background and laid in my usual kind of beige, rough background that I use for my maps, and I've started laying in the roads. We start just by establishing the entrances to the city, and then connecting the major roads to all the hotspots. The fortified central area, the market, and the harbor master. Then I start laying in a grid of road networks. And I figured with a city like this, if it starts around the fish market, starts around the dock, it's probably going to have kind of higgledy-piggledy roads at first, and only when there's more money and more investment in the infrastructure do we start to see a grid centered around the larger structures in the area, the fort, the marketplace, and so on. I also decided to include a temple here in that open space there just to the south of the fort. Filled in the roads. I decided to do some diagonal roads as well, just because I like messing with myself as I'm drawing these things. And I start to fill in the actual city blocks with buildings. At this point, I actually decided to create my own brush, because the brushes in the program I use, called Procreate, all the dedicated brushes that come with the program feature a round tip or an oval tip as far as fine points, so I decided to make my own. I used a rectangular tip to give myself a little bit more of a hard edge as I'm drawing these things. It means I can make slightly more broad brush strokes instead of pushing at tiny little pinpricks and having to be very exact. As I went through this, I filled in most of the city blocks, the more organized areas first. They were a little bit easier to do, they were a little bit faster to process, and I didn't have to create as many odd structures, because you might see as the streets get a little more nutty, the buildings in the streets start taking on some different shapes. They're more ramshackle, they're more built up around the geography rather than laid in by an architect. So I started to fill in these city streets as well. Started with the buildings around the temple, then up around the fort to the marketplace, and now we're starting to see that filled in. Once I got about halfway through the city, and we'll get there in just a minute, but once I got about halfway through filling in the city with buildings, I actually moved over to filling in around the harbor master. I find usually working out from a central point works best just to keep my mind focused, and once I'd filled in this half of the city, I needed a new central point to work from. Filling in these diagonal streets was a bit of a chore, I will admit. I wasn't sure what I was thinking when I did it, but there's a lot of triangular buildings in this section of the city, because the city planners had a bit of a falling out over a woman and a tankard of ale and decided to mess with each other's compasses. That's the story we're going with anyway. I think the real story here is that EJ just didn't think ahead when he laid in those streets. We're starting to fill in the area around the harbor master now, filling in towards the docks, still moving away from that center point of the fort, and starting to move along the walls as well, because those make a nice, easy reference point. In the future, I know for a fact that I'll be making much more close-up views of smaller cities just because of the chore of very tiny buildings. That little area outside the city is a workshop of House Cannith. They're artificers, which means they make magical technological marvels. Think Iron Man, but out of metal and wood instead of metal and wires. And that's where the party actually comes in. Now that the city itself is filled in, I start to fill in the surrounding countryside. We start with roads. This is located in a wasteland, so I faded out the roads a little bit to give them some more disrepair, then dropped the opacity so that they weren't quite so full. Then I went ahead and started to block in the mountains in the south. I figure there's one large peak with a few branches off of it just south of the city. So I decided to go with a couple arms reaching towards the city. I learned this technique for drawing mountains from a blog called fantasymaps.com, I believe is the name of the website. I could be wrong there, but I will try to put a link in the description just so that you guys can go check it out as well. I've learned a lot about map drawing. But what I'm doing is filling in first the basic outline of the mountain's topmost ridge. Anywhere there's peaks, I might add an extra branch, and then I start to shade in. I choose which direction the sun is facing. In this case, it's coming from the southeast, so anything to the northwest is in shadow, anything to the southeast is in sun, and I use a blue and yellow color scheme. So I make an overlay layer, which allows me to change the value and some of the tone without going too obscene with it. And I lay in that first layer and start to kind of feather outward from the mountains. Once that's done, I go in on the opposite sides and add a few layers of slightly higher shadow or highlight, and then turn the opacity down to 50% so that I can lay in a second layer of slightly more intense detail on the mountains. Once that's done, I turn that layer opacity and the saturation of both down. I shaded in the water there as well so that it would be a little bit darker than the surrounding countryside. And then I set the actual wasteland to gray and the land across to green. I laid in a cloud layer as well because there's a dead gray mist wall over it. And then we can see as EJ struggles to write very simple words with a pen on an iPad. I chose to go with a white font instead of a black. It stood out a little bit more over the city and over the surrounding countryside. Started labeling things like the crypt and watchtower I had drawn in by the mountains, added a compass rose, and labeled the mist, and that was it. Thanks for sticking with it. If you've made it this far, give yourself a pat on the back, have a cup of coffee, you've earned it. I know this isn't usually the kind of content you've come to expect from the channel, but it's something I've really enjoyed over the past few weeks. Getting to mess around drawing maps and creating these sorts of things is a lot of fun. If you want me to see more of this as I draw more maps, by all means, let me know in the comments. I'll upload a few more time-lapse videos, maybe throw in a few more tips from that blog that I've learned and a few others I've picked up along the way myself. With all that said, I've been your evocative, provocative, talkative host, EJ, signing off.